Welcome to this episode of the Aquarist's Edge, a podcast for home aquarists just like you. Learn more about how to keep a thriving aquarium and discover ideas and tips to give your aquarium the edge. And now, over to our host, Arthur Preston.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Aquarist's Edge. Today we're going to flip the script on algae. Algae isn't always the villain of your aquarium story. It's often the narrator. It's a running commentary on what's happening with the light, the nutrients, the carbon, the flow, the maintenance of your tank. And once you learn to read algae, instead of coming into a rage and grabbing every algae magnet and cleaner you can find, I'm going to suggest today that you stop fighting your tank and start steering it in the correct direction. If you ever looked at green dust on the glass and thought, oh my gosh, I failed as an aquarist, or you've pulled out a piece of decor that looks like it grew a beard overnight, then this episode is for you. I'm going to try and help you to reframe algae as information. Let's call it a progress report, not good or bad, just feedback. And by the end of this episode, you're going to know why algae appears even in so-called clean tanks, what different algae types usually indicate, how to fix algae without nuking your balance, and how to build a tank where algae stays manageable, even if it never disappears completely. So, let's think about this. Why does algae bother you? Do you think it doesn't look nice? Do you think it makes your tank unhealthy? Does it tell you that something's wrong about your tank? Maybe the balance is out? What is it? Perhaps drop a comment, or either if you're listening on the podcast app, pop a comment there to let us know, or maybe put a comment if you're watching this or listening to this on YouTube. Let's find out what you're battling, what your mindset is around algae, and let's go on to figure out how we can get that right. How can we change our mindset around algae? How do we in fact flip the script? So first, let's remove the shame from algae. Algae spores are basically everywhere. They hitchhike on plants, on decor, on your nets, the bags of fish. They even come in your hands, and in many cases they are already in your water supply at tiny levels. A so-called sterile aquarium is not a realistic goal, and really it shouldn't be one. Algae is a photosynthetic organism, or a group of organisms. That simply means it uses light and available nutrients to grow. That's it. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't appear because you missed one water change and the tank decided to punish you. It appears because the conditions allowed it to grow. And here's the big concept for today. Algae is an imbalance, not always a nutrient excess. It's often an imbalance between how much light you're providing and how well your system can use that light productively. And productively usually means the following. Plants are growing steadily, beneficial bacteria are doing their job, fish waste is being processed, organics are being exported, and nothing is wildly fluctuating. Algae thrives when something is abundant and something else is limiting. For example, you might have loads of light and plenty of nitrate and phosphate, but not enough available carbon. Or your plants are stressed by inconsistent carbon dioxide, or micronutrients are out of whack. Plants stall, and the algae says, great, I'll take it from here. The opposite may also be true. You might have low nutrients and high light. Plants can't grow because they're starving, but algae still manages because it can adapt quickly. That's why blanket advice such as, to get rid of your algae, just reduce your nitrates or stop fertilizing, that advice can backfire. Sometimes the algae is screaming right at us and it's telling us your plants are underfed. Tom Barr, who's well known in the plant tank world, he popularized practical nutrient management in the aquariums, has long pushed the idea that stability and consistent plant growth are the real keys here, rather than chasing a single perfect nitrate number. The point isn't the exact value, it's whether your plants are consistently outcompeting algae. So if the algae appears, don't ask, how do I kill it? Rather ask yourself, what is it telling me about my system? So let's quickly dig into some of the common algae types and what they often indicate. And now remember, these aren't rigid rules, they are more like strong patterns. The first one we see is that green film on the glass, or green dust. That's that light green coating that you're probably scraping away every couple of days. This often shows up with high light exposure and a tank that's maturing into its rhythm. It can also show up when nutrient availability is inconsistent. But in many tanks, green film algae is really quite normal. If you're scraping glass once a week and everything else looks great, that's not a crisis. That's an aquarium being an aquarium. If you want to reduce it, you can shorten the period of lighting on the aquarium each day. You can improve consistency, in other words, have the same light schedule daily. You can keep up water changes and plant trimming. Secondly, we come across green hair algae, or what is often called string algae. It's that kind of candy floss or cotton candy look. This is often connected to too much light, inconsistent CO2, and organic buildup. That's malm, decaying leaves, and overfeeding. It loves tanks where plants are struggling or where plants are slow. And we manage this by removing it manually. That's always our first step. We can reduce the light intensity or duration. We can increase the mass of plants in the tank. We can improve the water flow so nutrients don't stagnate in dead spots. And we can remove decaying leaves quickly. A third algae it's quite common really, is blackbeard algae. And this appears as dark tufts on wood and filter outlets and plant edges. And blackbeard algae, or BBA, often appears where the flow is strong, not because the flow causes it, but because flow delivers a steady stream of nutrients and carbon. And if plants aren't using those resources efficiently, the blackbeard algae does. A big common factor here is instability, especially inconsistent CO2 in injected systems, but also inconsistent maintenance in general. We manage blackbeard algae by stabilizing the schedule, that's the lights, maybe our fertilizing schedule, our water changes. We can clean the filter and improve mechanical filtration to reduce the organics. We can make sure our plants are nutrient limited. We can also spot treat carefully if you choose, but remember the long-term win here is stability, not immediate treatment. Then we get to diatom algae, or the brown dust. This often happens early on in a tank's life, also with tanks with low light and lots of silicates. Diatoms often come into new tanks during the first few weeks or months. It can also show up when you've changed substrate, added a lot of new hardscape, or your tank is low in competition from plants. And the way we manage diatom algae is through patience and maintenance. We can increase the plant mass, we can keep our light moderate, wipe the surfaces and siphon gently, and truth be told, this often resolves itself as the tank matures. Then there's something that happens in our tanks which isn't true algae. It's cyanobacteria. That's that blue-green, what we think is algae. It's actually photosynthetic bacteria, and it forms slimy sheets and can smell earthy or musty. It's often linked to low flow areas, excess organics, and imbalance where the plants aren't thriving. And we can manage this by increasing the flow in dead spots, by removing as much of it as possible manually. We can improve our maintenance and reduce detritus, and we can make lighting and feeding more consistent. So let's then talk about the algae triangle: light, nutrients, and carbon. The more light you provide, the more the tank demands nutrients and carbon to keep plants growing smoothly. If those requirements aren't met, algae steps in. Light isn't good. Light is powerful. You can compare it to fire. You can cook dinner with it, or you can burn the house down. Let's remember that long photo periods, like 10 to 12 hours, especially with strong LED lighting, is going to be a wonderful space for algae to take hold. And a very workable starting point for many tanks is 6 to 8 hours, not because algae hates shorter days, but because you're matching energy input to your tank's current ability to use it. And intensity matters as much as duration. If your light is adjustable, sometimes the best fix isn't changing hours, it's lowering the intensity of the light. Let's also not forget nutrients. Plants need macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and micronutrients such as iron. Fish waste supply some of this, but not always in the correct balance. And so algae often appears when nutrients fluctuate wildly, when one nutrient is consistently limiting, or organics accumulate faster than they are being used. What about carbon? In a CO2 injected tank, carbon dioxide stability is a huge deal. In a non-CO2 tank, carbon is still involved. You must remember that plants rely on available carbon sources in the water and from breakdown processes, but it is slower and it's more limiting. And this simply means that in low-tech tanks, too much light is the number one algae accelerant because you're demanding growth that your system simply cannot supply. But in this triangle of nutrients and carbon and light, there's a fourth element. and that is stability. It's really the big one because nobody wants to hear it because it's less about quick fix or product and more about practice. We bring stability by our feeding, our water changes, our light schedule, our plant trimming, cleaning of the filters, and plant fertilization. Algae just loves chaos. Plants hate it. Now that's not philosophy, it's biology. Plants are slower to respond, and algae can bloom fast. So how do we algae-proof our aquarium without chasing zero algae? There's a mind shift that needs to happen here. You're not trying to get rid of algae altogether. You're not trying to eradicate it. You're trying to make algae boring. And what is boring algae? Well, boring algae is quite simply a light green film that you wipe weekly, maybe a little brown dust in a new tank that fades over time, and the occasional spot algae that you remove during maintenance. It's not emergency algae, where you can't see anything in your tank. So how do we make algae boring? Firstly, pick a realistic light schedule. If you're fighting algae, try 7 hours for 2 weeks. If you're running intense lighting, consider 6 hours. Remember that consistency matters more than perfection. Same time, every day. The second step is to increase our plant mass and pick the correct plants. Plants are your algae control, not because they eat algae, but because they compete with algae. Fast growers in freshwater planted tanks can include stem plants and floating plants, as well as some hardy rosette plants, depending on your setup. And even if you're not into plants, adding a few easy species can transform your stability. A tank with sparse plants and strong light is basically an invitation for algae to come in and take hold. The third step is to control your organics. This is a huge issue and often under-discussed. Organics would be things like your malm buildup in low-flow areas, uneaten food, decaying plant leaves, dirty filter media clogged with fine debris. Organics fuel algae indirectly by destabilizing conditions and adding nutrient spikes in microzones. So we deal with this by doing regular detritus siphoning during water changes, by removing dying leaves promptly, but not overfeeding, and by cleaning our filter on a schedule that matches the stocking in the tank. The fourth step is to improve flow, but don't turn your tank into a washing machine. You want gentle, even circulation, which will mean fewer dead spots. You'll sometimes find that algae will always grow in the same area of your tank, and that area is telling you something. Food and waste settle there. Carbon dioxide, if used, doesn't reach there, and plants struggle there, and the algae says thanks very much. Step 5 is to stop doing reset cleans. You know what I'm talking about here. It's when you empty out your tank, you reset everything, you scrub everything, you replace all the filter media, do a massive change in one day. Now that can actually worsen your algae because you remove stability. Remember that you are wanting gradual improvement. So what can you do this week? What's something practical? If algae is getting ahead of you, here's a simple 7-day approach that avoids chaos. Number 1, manual removal and reset the rules. So scrape your glass, remove any algae you can physically pull out, trim affected leaves, clean the worst decor areas with tank water during a water change, and do a 30 to 50% water change depending on the stocking of your tank. The goal here is not clean perfection, it's to remove biomass so your system isn't constantly fighting from behind. That's day 1. Day 2 and 3, we look at our lighting. Set a timer. Drop your period of lighting to 6 to 7 hours. And if your light is adjustable, reduce the intensity by about 10 to 30% as a starting point. On day 4, look at improving your flow and maintenance points. So redirect your filter outlet to reduce dead spots, gently siphon settled debris, and rinse your mechanical media in old tank water. Day 5 to 7, here we start focusing on our plants. If you use fertilizer, dose consistently rather than randomly. And if you don't use fertilizer, consider whether plants are stalling due to lack of nutrients, especially in heavily planted tanks with live fish stocking. And consider adding a floating plant temporarily if your setup allows you to. Floating plants can absorb nutrients fast, and they shade the tank slightly. Then repeat a normal weekly maintenance cycle for a few weeks. Algae really is sorted out in 48 hours because your tank needs time to shift. Remember, you are developing an ecosystem. Now, let's talk about those fish and those animals that are sold to you as algae eaters. And let's be mindful of the fact that these are helpful co-workers, not the so-called cleanup crew. Algae eaters are great. but they're not a replacement for balance. They can help you keep algae from becoming established, especially firm algae and soft growth. But if your tank is producing more algae than anything can graze, algae eaters won't solve the root issue here. Also, please don't buy animals as tools without considering whether your tank suits them long term. Check their size, their behavior, compatibility, and diet. I'm going to ask you to think of algae eaters as co-workers. They help when the system is already heading in the right direction. Let's have a look at some of the myths that keep people stuck in managing their algae. The first myth is that people will tell you, algae means my tank is dirty. Well, that's not necessarily true. It often means your energy input, like light, doesn't match your system's capacity. The second myth is this: if I get my nitrates to 0, algae will stop. Well, here's the truth. Plants need nitrogen, and 0 nitrogen or nitrates can stress plants, and stressed plants will lose the competition with algae. Myth 3, if I stop fertilizing, algae will go away. Sometimes algae is present because plants are already failing. Starving them more can worsen the situation. The fourth myth is that you need to go buy some miracle chemical in a bottle. Well, short-term treatments can help, but if you don't correct the imbalance, algae returns, and often in a stronger way. The fifth myth is my tank must look like a showroom every day. Not true. A living aquarium changes day to day, and a little bit of algae is not a disaster. So let's begin to wrap this up. Remember, algae is not the enemy. It's a feedback mechanism, and if you learn to interpret it, algae becomes one of the most useful diagnostic tools in fish keeping. Our key takeaways from this episode are that light drives demand. Too much light is the fastest way to invite algae. Algae often signals imbalance, not only too many nutrients. Stability will beat panic cleaning every time. Manual removal plus slow, consistent improvement wins. And lastly, your goal is not 0 algae. It's boring, manageable algae. I'd love to hear your comments on the podcast app or on the YouTube comment section. What algae are you seeing, and what's your current schedule, and how are you managing this? And I'm sure that your comments and your questions are going to be helpful to many who are also struggling perhaps with understanding algae in their tanks. Folks, again, I want to thank you for the time you spent today listening to this podcast. If you are listening on your podcast app, please won't you rate and review the podcast, perhaps leave a comment. If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any episodes in the future. And so until next week, keep learning, keep discovering, and keep enjoying this amazing hobby. Bye for now.
That's it for this episode of the Aquarist Edge. Please consider subscribing to this podcast so that you don't miss further episodes. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast, as this helps make it visible to others. Until next time, keep learning and discovering, and keep finding your Aquarist Edge in this captivating and fascinating hobby.